So welcome to the second half of this course. So in the first half we've been looking at the hippocampus and the way that it's involved in memory, and we've looked at some of the neurobiological mechanisms of memory and consolidation and all of that kind of thing. And we've briefly met the idea that the hippocampus, like part of the role that it has in memory, is forming a spatial map that could be used to organise memory subsequently. So the basic idea is that during evolution, the hippocampus evolved the ability to represent where things were, and then on top of that, where events occurred. So where was the animal when a particular event occurred? And so that's why episodic memory and spatial memory are so naturally bound together. So what I want to do in now, in this half of the course, is to look at the spatial side of all of that. Because, for various reasons. One is that space is a really, it's quite a good model system for looking at cognition, because we sort of understand what's required of encoding space, mathematically speaking. And also because it's just a really interesting thing in its own right. Like, how does the brain create this sort of abstract representation of things like distance and direction, so these metric quantities. So it's interesting for several reasons, and as a result of that, it's been a really hot topic for a few decades now. And there have been a couple of really important discoveries, and we've already met place cells, but they were just the beginning. And so in this half of the course, we're going to look at some of the other discoveries and how we're piecing together this picture of how it all works. So first of all, I want to just give you an introduction to the varieties of spatial behaviour that are out there in the world. There's some really amazing feats that animals are capable of. And I want to introduce the basic commonality, the thing that is really fundamental to almost all of these types of spatial behaviour, which is this notion of a vector. So something about a distance and a direction from one place to another place. And typically that would be from the home base to a place where there's food or something like that. So this slide is showing an example of something that is a really fundamental process in spatial cognition, and this is a thing called path integration. So there have been many studies in different species of path integration now, but the classic ones were done using this animal here, the desert ant. So these ants, so this particular species, Cataglyphus fortis, lives in the desert and lives underground because the desert is obviously very hot. And the ants come out of the ground and they wander over the ground looking for food. So they might go hundreds of meters away from the nest, and they will make a very circuitous route as they do so. So they will be searching in this kind of foraging pattern. But then when an ant finds a piece of food, a dead bug or something, it will pick it up, turn it around, and it will go straight back to the nest. And the question is, how does it know where the nest is? So this is featureless terrain. There's no particular landmarks. And Rudy Vayner and his colleagues spent many years studying these ants, and they found that that the ant seems to have a continually maintained homing vector, as they called it. So the way he found this is he found that if you pick up an ant that's just found food and you move it 2 meters to one side and then see where it goes, the path that the ant takes will be in the correct direction back to the nest, and the ant will walk for roughly the correct distance. But of course it won't find the nest because it's been moved over. And then, having not found the nest, it'll start to search for it. It'll do this kind of looping search. So that indicates that the ant wasn't doing something like tracking the odour of the nest or using some what we would call beacon source of information, because if that were the case, it would have adjusted its homing angle to go back to the nest. So that tells us that the ant knew the direction and the distance back to the nest, so it had a homing vector. We now know that this is true for many animals in the animal kingdom, including ourselves and other mammals. As we move around, we have the capacity to compute the distance and the direction between where we are now and other places. I should say, incidentally, that there's a slight distinction to be made between the process of continually updating the positional calculation, which is called path integration, and the process of finding your way back to where you started from. So that process is called homing. And those things, the term path integration is sometimes erroneously used to mean homing, so that they sometimes get mixed up. But these days we use path integration to mean the continual updating process. And it takes place on the basis of tracking movements. So the brain is logging constantly the movements that you make as time unfolds. So what distance and what direction were you moving in and how fast and so on. The second kind of behaviour that has been very intensively studied and very influential in our thinking is also in insects. So this is the honeybee. And these studies were begun by Carl von Frisch, and he won the Nobel Prize eventually for discovering that honeybees also compute vectors. So what happens with honeybees? They live in hives, and the worker bees will leave the hive and they'll go and they'll search the surrounding environment, fields or whatever, until they find a patch of flowers, and then they'll gather nectar and they'll go back to the hive. And what von Frisch found was that sometime after the first bee has found a new patch of flowers and gone back to the hive, other bees will come out of the hive and they'll go straight to that patch of flowers. And he was curious as to how they could do this. And so he set up a laboratory kind of version of a hive where he could see what the bees were doing. And he discovered that when the first bee returns, having just found the new patch of flowers, it does a kind of a dance called the waggle dance. And you can see it in this diagram here. There are two components to it. So the bee will, it'll walk sort of up, waggling its tail as it goes, and then it'll come back round again. And what von Frisch found is that the angle of the upward leg of that dance changes with the direction of the food. So it seems to be related to the direction of the food, and what it's specifically related to is the angle of the sun with relation to the direction of the food. So that angle is basically telling the other bees, when you come out of the hive, look for the sun, and then this is the angle you have to make. And interestingly, if you make the bees have to wait for a while before they do their dance, they will change their angle to accommodate the motion of the sun. It's a really remarkable set of integrated little clocks and so on. And then the waggling, the intensity of the waggling gives the other bees an indication of how far they have to go. So a really intense waggle means that you have to fly in that direction for a long time, and a not such intense one means it's quite close by. So with the waggle dance, the bee is communicating vectorial information about the distance and the direction to the flowers. Sticking with insects, another really important type of spatial behaviour that is used a lot in our thinking about how we might synthesize spatial behaviour. So, for example, trying to design autonomous vehicles and so on. There's this behaviour called view matching, which is shown by quite a lot of insects. So this example here is the digger wasp. And what digger wasps do is when they leave the nest, they will turn around and face it, and they'll fly backwards in a zigzagging kind of path. And you can see on the left here that zigzagging path is the outward bound path of the wasp. So what we now know it's doing is it's looking at the nest, and it's trying to store in its memory a view of the entrance to the nest from different places. So, if the wasp is coming back to the nest, there are all of these different views of the nest that are consistent with the actual nest. And so they do this kind of learning flight, and then after they've learned the nest, then they're able to kind of fly straight back. So this behaviour is called view matching. So the insects are somehow storing a snapshot in their very tiny memory of the visual appearance of the nest. Moving now from insects to vertebrates. So another type of spatial behaviour that's been very intensively studied is food storing. So this is a kind of behaviour that's exhibited by a lot of animals that overwinter in the northern hemisphere, where things get very cold. The trees will lose their leaves, and there's not much food around. And quite a few species will prepare for winter by storing durable food that they can then go back to over the course of the winter and retrieve. So they're kind of stocking up ready for winter. So we've got two species here, squirrels on the left and the And corvids are the crow family, and this is a particular kind of food storing corvid, the Clark's nutcracker. And these animals can store hundreds or thousands of pieces of food during the course of the autumn. And they are very good at finding the food again as the winter unfolds. And laboratory studies have found that they don't just store the food in random locations, so that they're not just using some algorithm like always store food under rocks or in holes or something, and then I'll just go and check all the rocks and all the holes. They actually remember the specific location of each item of stored food. And Nikki Clayton, who has studied these birds for quite a long time, has found that they can also register whether, when they stored the food, they were being watched by another bird. And if they were being watched, they'll wait for some period of time, and then when the other bird's gone away, they'll take the food and they'll hide it somewhere else, so they'll move it. And she's also shown that the animals can remember not just where they stored the food, but they can also remember what they stored. And we'll come back to this later. So they have this quite detailed memory of the location. And that seems to be related to hippocampal size. So in the autumn, the size of the hippocampus of these animals enlarges, and then in the springtime, it shrinks again. So then, so that was sort of remembering specific locations in space, but also animals will show short-range navigation, so they're able to venture out of their nest and then explore the environment and learn the layout of the environment and learn where things are. And the animals that we study most in the laboratory are these kind of short-range navigators, so rats and mice. And much of what we know about the neurobiology of spatial encoding is to do with the short-range spatial behaviour, so learning the layout of the local environment. And we've learned quite a lot about how that's done now, and that's what we're going to be looking at with place cells and grid cells. This kind of behaviour is called beacon navigation. We don't know as much about beacon navigation as we know about map-based navigation, but beacon navigation means orienting to some kind of stimulus in the environment that is known to be associated with a desirable location, so food or the nest or something like that. And what we do know about beacon navigation is that it's not hippocampal dependent. So even animals without a hippocampus can do this kind of beacon orienting towards a stimulus. It's quite a primitive type of spatial behaviour. It's sort of similar even to what bacteria can do, and they can show chemotaxis, which is moving towards a chemical gradient. So chemotaxis is like a very specific form of beacon navigation. It's quite simple, but it does, the more complex form of it does require that animals can memorize the nature of the beacon. What does it look like? Because there may be many things that could be beacons, and they need to make sure that they get the right one. Then there's a variety of longer range types of navigation, and these are the ones that people probably know about most because they are so spectacular. So long range migration means animals that move seasonally very, very long distances. So this can be hundreds or more typically thousands of miles. In fact, Arctic terns go from the North Pole to the South Pole in the winter, and then back to the North Pole in the summer. So that's that's 12,000 miles, so that's an extraordinary distance. And many different kinds of animals can do this, so from different sort of orders within the animal kingdom. So we've got some examples of, birds and insects, and the loggerhead turtle, which can swim thousands of miles across the ocean, salmon, which can make their way from their breeding ground to the food places in the ocean and then back to where they were born to spawn, like all of these amazing types of phenomenon. And we don't know how this is done, but there is some suggestion that it's not the same type of spatial behaviour as the more local range kind of hippocampal map dependent spatial behaviour. And we think that there may be some type of compass involved, but there's a lot of debate about where that compass is in the brain and how it works and so on. So we have all of these different kinds of spatial behaviour, and we need to somehow try and make some type of organising framework so that we can study this in different species and know that we're all talking about the same thing. So a few years ago I got together with some colleagues and we came up with this kind of taxonomy of navigation, which is shown in this table here. And what we've done is we've created a kind of a hierarchical ordering of different kinds of phenomenon that are involved in spatial navigation. So the hierarchy is kind of shown from left to right, with the bottom of the hierarchy on the left and then the more complex parts on the right. So level 1, we've called this the sensory motor toolbox. So this is a collection of all the sensory modalities that we know to be involved in different kinds of spatial behaviour. So for example, vision is very important in primates like ourselves, and also turns out to be really important for many other animals such as rats and mice. But there are other things too. Olfaction is very important in many species. Touch, kinesthetic senses, proprioception, and so on. So these are the sensory modalities, but in and of themselves they're not spatial. They are just informative as to the type of information that is spatial, and that's represented by those subsequent layers in the hierarchy. So the next one is spatial primitives, and these are sort of little cognitive constructs that have been assembled from the incoming sensory motor information. And again, they are not in and of themselves completely spatial, but they pertain to space. So for example, a landmark is a type of object, but it's a type of object that has a spatial meaning in a spatial map. So it indicates perhaps a spatial location, or it can be used to organize the directional compass or something like that. And there are other types of information that can be informative too, for example, the slope of the terrain, the magnetic compass, and all of these kinds of things. So we've called these spatial primitives. Then the third level is spatial constructs, and these are now more truly spatial. So these are assembled from those primitives, which in turn had been assembled from the sensory motor fragments, if you like. And this includes things like the cognitive map, which is what we're going to be looking at in a great deal of detail. And also just sort of self-localization, so working out where you are in relation to other important places in the environment, which may or may not be in a map-like manner. Goal localization, so knowing where your goal is relative to you, and so on and so on. And then the final level of the hierarchy we've created just for humans, because as humans we've got language, and language has given us some capabilities that other animals don't have. For example, the ability to communicate locations of things across time, so I can tell somebody who, a year later can tell somebody else, and so on and so on. So this has given us a whole new set of capabilities, and one of those is creating maps. So we create maps which are a kind of a schematic representation of spatial location. So we're not going to go into that so much in this course, but it is in and of itself a very big field of inquiry. So those were the natural spatial behaviours that have inspired the study of spatial cognition. What we're going to do in the next lecture is look at how we have taken some of these and imported them into the laboratory, and starting to try and pick them apart and understand how the brain is involved in organising these behaviours.